Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon. My name is Carol Werner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. We are very pleased to have joined us this afternoon as a co-sponsor of this briefing, the China Facts Project of the World Resources Institute. We have a wonderful panel with us this afternoon to talk about issues that I think many of us have been discussing in many conversations, in countless meetings, hearings, and private conferences across the country. And that is to take a look and to have a better understanding of China's energy and climate initiatives. What are the implications of China's policies? What are they accomplishing in terms of thinking about all of the technology advances that are being made and all of the great advances in development that China is experiencing? This has brought many successes, it's brought many challenges, and there are many, many implications with regard to thinking about the U.S. role as well as China's role in this global economy. And so there have been many times where there have been discussions thinking about what does this mean for competitiveness for the U.S. with regard to looking over one shoulder as we see the huge expansion of renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies being both manufactured in China as well as being deployed within China. What are the implications of that? What are ways in which we can collaborate and cooperate that will benefit both countries? We have the opportunity to hear firsthand from people who are spending a lot of time on these topics. We will start our panel this afternoon by hearing from Joanna Lewis. And Dr. Lewis is an assistant professor of science, technology, and international affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She spends most of her research time in China, is based in China, and her research is focused primarily on the renewable energy industry and policy development, mechanisms for low-carbon technology transfer in the developing world, as well as expanding options for multilateral engagement in a post-2012 international climate change agreement. She is also an international advisor to many China-U.S. committees and has spent a lot of time and has a lot of experience in China looking exactly at the issues before us this afternoon. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. Great. So I wanted to start off my presentation today by highlighting some of the achievements that China has made in the area of clean energy over the last few years. China is now the leading manufacturer of most renewable energy technologies. This would include small and large wind turbines, solar photovoltaic panels, small and large hydropower turbines, solar hot water heaters, as well as many others. Last year, China became the largest wind market in the world and the world's largest user of clean energy overall. And China is not just doing this at a small scale. When you think about deploying solar and wind technology, they're doing this at a gigawatt scale. So this is the kind of scale that we are talking about with other more traditional power plant technology. China is one of the first countries to be looking at renewables as contributing a relatively large capacity to the electricity sector. And we've recently heard that China invested about $54 billion in clean energy last year, more than any other country in the world. They're also making major achievements by shutting down some of the dirty fossil fuel powered energy capacity within their country. Of course, China still gets about 80% of its electricity from coal, but many of the new coal plants that are going in are state of the art, are highly efficient, and some of the older plants are being closed down, with over 70 gigawatts of fossil fuel plants closed during the 11th five-year plan period, 2006 to 2010. And China is putting in place many key improvements in the collection of energy statistics, as well as incentives for local enforcement. And this is what is allowing them to achieve many of the goals that they've put forward over the last few years and will be putting forward in the years to come. So today I'm going to focus on how some of these achievements were accomplished and what we might expect to see from China in the years ahead. So as you know, China, energy intensity has been a real focus of many of China's efforts over the last few years. And this was because China saw a decline in energy intensity over the last couple of decades, from 1980 to about 2002. This trend reversed, meaning that during the early part of this decade, China was seeing energy consumption grow faster than economic growth. And this was worrisome to the country because they had seen this decline in the ratio between energy consumption and GDP for decades. And this resurgence in this increasing level of energy intensity caused the government to put in place a target during the 11th five-year plan period beginning in 2006 to reduce energy intensity by 20% from 2006 to 2010. They fell just slightly short of meeting this target according to the statistics that are coming out of the government, but achieved roughly 19% decline. But I think more importantly than the actual numbers, the fact that they were able to flip that curve, that they were able to reverse the trend. And this was not easy to do. They did this through a combination of programs. I know some of the speakers will elaborate on some of these later, so I won't go into them in detail. But some of the key programs that really helped China to shift this curve and to decrease the intensity of the economy, the energy intensity of the economy, included something called the Top 1,000 program, which targeted the largest energy-consuming enterprises throughout the country. When faced with a national target that's somewhat nebulous, it's sort of hard to know where do you start in actually making changes at the local level to improve the efficiency with which energy is used. And so it was strategic to start with some of the largest enterprises that consume together about 1/3 of China's total energy. And of course, focusing on the industrial sector in China is important because industry consumes about 70% of total energy consumption in China. Other programs included the 10 Key Projects program, which helped to provide financial incentives for some of these efficiency improvements. More plants were shut down, the ones I mentioned in the thermal power capacity sector, as well as within the industrial sector. Many laws were passed, including the 2007 Energy Conservation Law, which helped to push forward many of these efficiency improvements. And of course, the end goal here is really for China to restructure its economy, to move away from a reliance on heavy industry and towards a more service-based economy. But this is easier said than done, and it's really hard to shift an economy this large very rapidly. But they are making progress in that regard. I want to turn to talking about some of China's achievements in renewable energy that we've seen over the last few years. We've heard about China's achievements in solar photovoltaic manufacturing. This shows some of the leading Chinese companies and their market share in 2009. You can see that many of the large global players are now from China, based in China. We also have, of course, foreign-owned companies manufacturing in China. But I think it's important to note that there are many Chinese-owned companies that have their own technology, their own innovation taking place, their own research and development programs that are pushing this industry forward. China is also playing an important role in the cost reductions that we've seen in solar photovoltaic technology over the last decade or so. Because China is where a lot of this manufacturing scale is occurring, if you just look at China's overall contribution to the amount of photovoltaic panels that have been produced over the last decade or so, you can see, and the price reduction that has taken place, while it's hard to sort of look at what China's role is in driving solar down the learning curve, I think it's safe to say that there's been a sizable role, because as we're deploying more and more solar technology, as we're manufacturing more technology, we are seeing the costs come down, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from our other speakers later. Wind has been another area where China has had some dramatic achievements in the last 5 years. This is a chart that shows China's share of total global wind power installations that have taken place over the last couple of decades. And you can see that back in the 1990s, very little of global wind power capacity was being installed within China. But this changed dramatically, really from 2005 on. And you can see the center of gravity has really shifted for the global wind power industry to China. With that, we've seen the emergence of many new Chinese-owned wind turbine manufacturers. Also, all the foreign-owned wind turbine manufacturers that are competing globally are involved in the Chinese market because it is such a large market. But I think it's important to note that there have been some not just increases in the scale of wind that's gone in China, but in the actual technology that's being installed there. Chinese companies are representing an increasingly large share of the market in China. And over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in the average size of wind turbine being installed in China. Now, the size of a wind turbine is not a perfect proxy for how advanced the technology is, but we are seeing wind turbine sizes increase. And you can see that back in just 2004, the average size wind turbine that was going in China was just over 700 kilowatts. Today, the average turbine is well over 1 megawatt. And part of this has to do with government programs that are encouraging more and more advanced technology. And in some cases, larger and larger wind turbines, for example, those that are being used for offshore wind development, which China is also leading the way in right now. Wind development has really come from, I would say, a dual-pronged approach from the Chinese government, a very strategic policy approach to both support the deployment of wind power, but also industrial policies to help promote the development of a local wind power technology industry. And this graph lists some of the key policies that have been instrumental in that over the last few years, including research and development support from the government, programs that provide fixed price subsidies for wind power, including a feed-in tariff that was put in place in 2009 and has really helped improve the stability of the market and increase the investment in this sector. So I just want to briefly look at some of the policies that the government is looking at for the next 12 five-year plan period from 2011 to 2005. There is a new non-fossil energy target. This includes renewables as well as nuclear and hydropower, 11.4% of total energy use by 2015. This is an interim target to the 15% by 2020 target, which had been previously announced. A new energy intensity target, which has been announced, of 16% reduction for the next five-year plan period, so lower than the 20% in the previous five-year plan period. But if you assume that a lot of the easy efficiency improvements have already been made, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, this could actually represent a much more challenging target for the next 5 years. And we've seen a new target announced, a carbon intensity target. This is the first time China has announced an actual national level carbon target. It's, again, carbon indexed to economic growth, not an absolute target, but they're requiring a 17% reduction from 2011 to 2015. There's also strategic industries are being redefined in China and some new carbon policies, and I'm just going to briefly mention each of these. So in China, there have been what we call pillar industries, industries that have been targeted by the government as strategically important for national security and the public interest. And if you look at state-owned enterprises within China, about 70% of this ownership has been concentrated within these pillar industries. These are the traditional sectors like defense, telecom, the energy sectors. And within the 12 five-year plan, you've seen some interesting language defining what are being called new strategic and emerging industries within China, which are listed here. They include some of the energy conservation technologies, many of the renewable energy technologies, clean vehicle technologies. And the focus on these new industries will be important because they will likely receive access to dedicated industrial funds, be supported by industrial policy and research and development. So as I mentioned, the new carbon intensity target has been announced for 2015. This is part of a longer-term target which had been announced prior to the run-up to Copenhagen of a 40 to 45% reduction from 2005 levels by 2020. But what I think is even more interesting than the target itself are all the other programs that are being put in place to allow the country to measure the amount of carbon that's being emitted there and to be able to then use these numbers to set goals at the local level for enforcing this target. And lastly, I think we're going to see some very interesting carbon policies announced in the coming months. There are discussions of various environmental taxes. There are discussions of pilot cap-and-trade programs, which will likely be done in different parts of China, perhaps within a certain province or certain industrial sector. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Joanna. And it sounds like we may need to do a whole series on this whole topic. We will now hear from Debbie Salingson, who serves as a principal advisor to WRI's Climate and Energy Program in China, as well as to the China FACTS, China Climate and Energy Network. She does a lot of research and blogging with regard to issues connected to China and international climate policy, and has written quite recently on Chinese emissions technology issues as well as U.S.-China relations. She brings as well much international experience, having worked on energy and environment issues for more than 20 years for the U.S. State Department, where she had done work in China, India, Nepal, and New Zealand. Debbie?
So I thought I'd give everybody a PowerPoint break today. So I'm just going to talk, and I'm going to follow on from Joanna's excellent presentation of where we are on Chinese climate and energy policy to give you kind of my perspective on why I think that's where China is. And then we happily have Mr. Sun from the Chinese Embassy here to tell you the perspective from the Foreign Ministry on what China's real views are on things. So let me suggest to you, first of all, that the key thing about Chinese climate and energy policy is that they're doing this because it's in their own self-interest. And there have been a number of drivers that have gotten to China to the point where this real energy transformation that's going on has become sort of front and center in economic policy. I think the first driver has been energy security. It's been a concern of China's basically from the founding of the People's Republic. Energy security is a concern not only about imports, it's also a concern about security of supply. I don't know if you all recall a couple years ago when China faced huge snowstorms and had trouble supplying coal to power plants in the south. A diversification of energy sources and making energy more efficient addresses the various types of energy security issues that China faces. Secondly, China has been increasingly facing its environmental problems. I've lived in China for 17 of the last 27 years. I first got to China in 1984, and back then China was actually using relatively little energy. I mean, in the evenings they basically rolled up the sidewalks. The place was dark by 8 o'clock. But riding my bike through the streets of Beijing, I'd be showered in coal dust. It was dark, but it was also pretty dirty. People wanted to see economic growth, and that was pretty much the only priority. That's no longer the case. I think especially since 2000, you have a vision of wanting a complete set of developmental priorities, of being a modern and developed country in all the senses of the word, addressing social and environmental issues as well as economic growth and opportunity. And so we've seen the Ministry of Environment go from being an advisory body to being a regulatory body to becoming a ministry in 2007, and dealing with a wide variety of pollution issues has become important in the plan. While China did well on energy intensity under the 11th five-year plan, it actually exceeded its goals for the two environmental pollutants that it chose to regulate, sulfur dioxide and COD, chemical oxygen demand, a water pollution regulation. And they've added a number of new pollutants to the 12th five-year plan. So environmental pollution is a priority, and the more you can conserve energy, the less pollution you have to deal with. So there's a real win-win for addressing energy efficiency and for fuel substitution, for using more renewable energy as a substitute for a fossil fuel. Thirdly, I think we've talked already a little bit about climate change as a priority, and I think Mr. Swim will talk some more about that. China is increasingly aware of the damage that climate change can do in China. and the awareness of extreme climate events, the link between weather problems and climate change, and other risks for the future from heating, from water supply, are often talked about in China. And finally, there's this need to economically restructure, which is part of China's long-term economic future, that I think the Chinese are very much aware of the middle income trap, where developing countries get to kind of the middle income area and have trouble getting beyond that if they stay stuck in the same industries that they've been in for a long time. And so part of that is moving out of heavy industry and moving into high value added, knowledge intensive industry, and reforming energy policy and putting pressure on industry to use energy more efficiently and prioritizing the kind of high-tech industries that Joanna listed under the new pillar industries is essential to transforming their economy and avoiding this kind of middle-income trap. So what you see is energy policy actually supporting an economic vision. It's not a cost to that economic vision. And I think Joanna has really well outlined what the policies are that they're using to get there. And so I will jump to my third point, which is that China really is seeing this as an opportunity. And I think this presents a challenge for the United States. Are we looking at this as a cost, or are we looking at this as an opportunity? There is a whole new set of industries out there that we have the opportunity to develop new companies, new industry, new opportunities, new markets, and are we going to be part of this or not? I think it's important to realize that, this is often characterized in the discussion in the United States as some kind of race that one country will win or a contest. The reality is this table is not of a given size. If the United States plays, we're talking about expanding the size of the table and expanding opportunity for everyone. If we have more demand here for clean energy, we actually create more opportunities for everyone. We also create a larger market where prices get driven down more rapidly, creating more opportunity not just in the US and China, but for other countries around the world to invest more heavily in clean energy and making it cheaper for developing countries as they look to improve their energy supply. Because it is the case that having more energy up to a certain level, it improves the quality of life for people. I can say that China is today a brighter, warmer place than it was in 1984. But there is a need to do that in a way that's carbon conscious and cleaner and improves quality of life overall for people. And there's a real opportunity here also for synergies, for working together. We at the World Resources Institute are part of one of the U.S. Department of Energy's clean energy research centers focusing on clean coal. There are other ones that Mark heads, the one on clean buildings, and there's also one on electric vehicles. And these have been a tremendous new opportunity for academics, companies, and government to all work together in both countries to try to promote a cleaner future. And there's a tremendous enthusiasm in both sides for doing this kind of collaboration. There are a lot of opportunities to learn from each other, to experiment together, and to really promote this kind of transformation. And so the question is, how can each country use the things that we do best to actually promote this globally? So thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We are now going to turn to Mark Levine, and Dr. Levine has been working on energy efficiency issues for decades, and he is the senior staff scientist and the group leader and founder of the China Energy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And he has been at the LBL for many years, where he had really built up the whole role of energy efficiency, and particularly in terms of buildings, when he was the leader of the energy analysis program. And then he became the director of the environmental division at the National Lab, and which he served in that role up through 2006. But I think what's really important to note about Mark is that for the last couple decades, his real passion has been working on promoting energy efficiency and doing analysis of energy efficiency in China. Mark?
Thank you very much, Carol. I have a lot of view graphs to go through, so let me start. The title of this talk is, Will China Overwhelm the World with Its Greenhouse Gas Emissions? I'm particularly eager to give this talk in Washington, D.C., where I have heard that the statement made many times that, well, why should the U.S. bother when China is going to overwhelm us all? So I want to talk about that. It works. Let me start with a very quick introduction of the China Energy Group. We've been in business since 1988 and have worked collaboratively with Chinese partners for those 23 years. Our mission has been energy efficiency. We've stayed on energy efficiency the whole time, training Chinese, working collaboratively with them, and promoting energy efficiency policy in China. The group is now 16 people. These folks, and these folks. If you noted all those, fortunately their names are small enough that you can't be quizzed on them. In terms of achievements, I'd like to think we have quite a number, but there are two that I want to call your attention to. We brought energy efficiency standards for appliances to China. They had standards, but the standards were so loose, they really came from Russia and hadn't been modified since then. The standards were so loose that any appliance could easily meet them. And I had a series of discussions, sort of getting higher and higher, and at every level I learned that the Chinese were very, very interested in establishing appliance standards. And so we engaged in intensive training and collaboration to show the significance of what's happened with standards. Took about 10 years to build the Three Gorges Dam, and this is after 10 years. That's refrigerator standards. This is air conditioning standards. China today has standards for 26 products, and if I added the rest of them to this chart, it would well swamp the Three Gorges. So that gives you a sense of the importance of energy efficiency and the role that it can and indeed does play in China. And we have a new undertaking, which is the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, building energy efficiency. This is interesting and can be important as a collaborative research effort between the Chinese and the U.S. to develop technology that will reduce energy use and therefore carbon emissions. Now let's go to the subject of energy and CO2 emissions in China. The good news, part one, which is 22 years from my point of view of quite good news on energy demand side. Here you see GDP growth in China, and here you see energy growth in China. And this is truly shocking. For a developing country, the general view has always been that the country needs more energy per unit GDP in order to propel growth. And when I first went to China in 1987 and I saw these data through 1986, and they'd never been released outside of China. In those days, China was really hermetically sealed from the outside world. I said, can I believe that? and that got me intrigued and quickly led to our program. I looked over a lot of data, and I did believe it. I didn't know if it would continue, but what I did know was that in 1979, Deng Xiaoping called for a quadrupling of GDP in 20 years and only a doubling of energy. And there's a fascinating story about how he came to that, because that was certainly the opposite of what people believed at that time. He recognized that there was finite amount of investment money, energy, supply was a huge drain on investment, and all the other things they wanted to do couldn't be done if they invested, if all this investment money went to energy. That may have been the most important of a number of factors that drove this. But this experience wasn't it wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It was the result of very focused policies. I can give you one example. In China in 1980, all investment came from the government in those days, so they could keep track of it. The amount of money that was targeted to energy efficiency investment as a function of total investment was 0% when this started. By 1983, it was 12% of total investment was for energy efficiency investment, 3 years. They created a whole new infrastructure to do this. I can't say too much more about that because I have a few more charts to go through. Let's see what comes next. Okay. Then there were 3 years of quite bad news from the point of view of energy demand. The intensity for the first time increased significantly higher than GDP. And remember, we have 22 years of declining GDP. You saw this chart earlier from Joanna. And here's what happened in 2002 to 2005. So that's a major change. But it's a much bigger change than it kind of looks like on a curve. Let me show you what it actually meant. Okay, there's China's CO2 emissions and a projection from 2002 to 2000. I can't read the numbers, but I guess 8. There's what actually happened because of the change in the growth in the curve, and there's the U.S. So that whereas it was predicted that China would overcome the U.S. in a period of 2020 to 2025, it happened before by 2007, CO2 emissions. Now, we should recognize okay, this is the chart that does that. There's the U.S. This is per capita. And this is China per capita. So it goes up significantly, but it's still barely above the world average and dramatically below the U.S., even in spite of the 2002 to 2005 period. There were reasons for that dramatic increase. China entered the WTO. China became a believer in free markets. I felt I was back in the Reagan era during those times when I was in China. They deconstructed a very efficient and effective policy apparatus for energy efficiency in the country. And they entered into a huge construction boom, in part due to WTO and other factors. And so the result was China's steel production, here I give you a plot going from a little bit over 100 to all the way up to 250, and there's what happened. This is cement, and it went, well, in 2000 it was 600, it went to 1,400 in a period of 7 years. So that's what that curve means when it starts going up. So China has a huge impact. And in fact, by 2007, this was of great concern to the leaders of China, who had been steeped in the idea of energy efficiency, steeped in the idea of energy growing slower than GDP. It was something that was fundamentally believed in during that period. I was in China maybe 25, 30 times during that period, and they were very proud of that performance. Well, this just shows the comparison between U.S. and China. That will come up later, so you just notice how much greater China is than the U.S. And so in 2005, the government got very concerned, and it went up to the Politburo. And I want to note that the Politburo, while it makes announcements on specific targets for GDP, it does not get into specific targets for other activities. It gives priorities. And sometimes it's even hard to tell what the priorities are from their announcements. And on this occasion, China announced, starting with the Politburo, announced the 20% energy intensity, that's energy per unit GDP reduction goal in 5 years. And if we saw what happened in the time before, this enormous increase in all these energy-intensive products, the idea of turning this supertanker around in a short time is just, well, it's a little bit hard to imagine. Well, and I think you saw this also, but it makes it more dramatic to see the last part of it. That was only through 2009. We heard that 2010 is 19%, maybe 19.1%. It'll be modified as the Chinese look at the numbers more carefully. But, you know, that's a dramatic change, very dramatic. And I have some view graphs that go over their policies. I don't have time to really discuss them, but they had a huge range of policies. They started slowly, as you heard earlier. The first year was very slow. I think it was Debbie who pointed that out. Yeah, but that wasn't very surprising given that they had lost their apparatus. Part of their policy system was the federal government had comparable bureaus at the provincial level, at the city level, and they passed on what was desired in energy efficiency. Now, it isn't true that the locals listen to the federal government. That's been a big problem in China, except if it's deemed extremely important, in which case the whole country is turned into that as an objective. And they found it very hard because of the reasons I said, but it is, in fact, remarkable that with the leadership saying this over and over and over again. In fact, this 19% was seen as a failure. They had to get 20. I think most of us now, even they perhaps, will hear from the foreign ministers, representatives. I hope they feel it was in fact a great success. Okay, I want to turn now to the future because this is the part that I have to say surprised me. I've done work on scenarios to 2030, 2025, 2030, and when we were asked to do 2050, I said, you know, I don't want to do that. I can't say anything about 2050. Well, it turns out that if you stop at 2030, you miss some very, very important things. This has been okay. Assumptions on urbanization, on GDP growth declining after 2030 to quote normal levels, car ownership. I'll go through actually some of these later on when I discuss it, but these are relatively typical assumptions with the exception of the physical ones, which aren't typically assumptions at all in scenario building. I want to skip this. Okay, so with all these assumptions, and I'm going to come back and explain why this is the case, what we see here is that in our essentially base case, that you have fairly significant growth through 2030, and by 2035, this is energy, this is not CO2, this is just energy demand. You see by 2035 that it's leveling off. Now, if you push efficiency hard, you get something that has the same shape and a lower energy demand than the other curve. But the thing I want to call special attention to is the shape of that curve, the fact that it levels off over a period of time. Whoops, I'm pressing the wrong way. Okay. Now, I compare it with others, other forecasts, and those are ours, the two that you just saw. This is energy resource, sort of a base case on steroids. They never considered it a base case. It's the highest base case they could imagine. Their real base case is that one there. What you note is that we're not very far from that in the 2030 period, but it's a straight line. And it's a straight line from 2020 all the way out to 2050. They have a big, complicated model and does all kinds of calculations, comes out with a straight line. Okay? Now, there's IA, which is sort of the world source for energy forecasts. Straight line through, they only go to 2030. And the lower curve, this is a very low curve for ERI, and it's a straight line. Okay? So, and these are the most important scenarios for China. That is, the ERI scenario is the advice, the highest levels of government in China on what the future may look like, and EIA is sort of the gold standard. So the question is, why is that curve there, and do we believe it? And I hope, well, okay, there's another thing too, before I get into that basic question. This is an example. There's a lot of uncertainty by 2050 as to what the actual demand will be. And so I call greater attention to the curve than I do the absolute answer. But in fact, our base case has sort of typical assumptions. So, but that gives an idea of a range. What's different about our model from all the others is that we've built it up from the bottom. We have refrigerators in the model. We have number of refrigerators, refrigerator sales, the energy use of refrigerators, the size of refrigerators, their efficiency. We have air conditioners, saturation, efficiency. We have all kinds of individual appliances. Similarly, we have buildings. We have building area per person. We have thermal and energy efficiency of the building. We have industrial subsectors and so forth, so that we are literally building this up from the bottom. And what happens, what happens is that these things saturate. And by 2030, every household has about as many appliances as they will have. The residential floor area, we have it as between the Japanese per capita in the U.S. and closer to the U.S., which is very unlikely given the density of population in China. Similarly with commercial buildings, roadways and railways, we did the Eisenhower roadway plan in a little more than a decade, I think. China will, not too long from now, within a decade, have built out its highway system. In maybe a decade and a half, it'll build out its railroad system, at which point the need for cement and steel goes down. It's not going to keep growing. So that's one important factor. Exports of energy-intensive products, we've made what I think is the wrong assumption, too conservative. We assume that exports of steel will continue at today's levels. I think that's highly unlikely over the long run. That is not what China is going to export. It won't be a competitive advantage of China. Very low population growth in China, 80 million between now and 2030, 2035 increase in population. And so if you think of these physical things, let me take one further example. Let's take fertilizer. The typical way that the models, which, by the way, instead of having all this detail, typically have 1 point for residential, 1 point for commercial, 1 point for maybe a couple points for industry, a few different industries. They don't know this stuff. They can't. But let's take fertilizer. If you do a regression on fertilizer energy growth, you'd see that it's growing up. Okay? What's it going to do in the future? It's not going to grow up. It's not going to increase. The intensity of fertilizer use in China is already higher than desired and higher than the government desires. There's not going to be any more arable land, so you're not going to have more fertilizer. And furthermore, fertilizer is largely made from coal today. It will be made from natural gas. The energy use is going to go down for fertilizer fairly significantly. So our point is, by looking at specific end uses and looking at the physical relationship among them, you get a very different answer from the answer that virtually everybody else gets. And so my conclusion is, well, I don't want to go through this. There probably isn't time. Well, yeah, I do have half a minute. What I want to say is, on this issue of a cap for China, we've seen that there's fairly rapid growth between now and 2030. And it'll be dependent on GDP. In the long run, it won't because of all the saturations. In fact, it'll be very highly dependent on energy efficiency because that's the one variable you have to play with over the long run. So for that reason, I think a cap in the short run is very difficult because you just can't predict these things. In the long run, I think it's entirely feasible for China. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Our final two speakers, we invited to provide their perspectives to essentially serve in the role of respondents or commenters. And we are delighted to have with us today Mr. Sun, who is the first secretary of the Chinese Embassy here in Washington, where he is mainly in charge of climate change issues as well as other environmental issues. He was the director in charge of environmental issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China before he came to work in the embassy in 2009. And he has had a lot of experience in terms of dealing with the international climate change negotiations, participated in the Conference of Parties, COPs 10 through 13 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we are delighted to have Mr. Sun provide some of his perspectives and comments with regard to the topics we're looking at today. Mr. Sun?
Thank you, Ms. Carroll, for inviting me to participate in this briefing. It is a great honor for me to make some response to the presentations already made on China's energy policies and measures. The Chinese government attaches great importance to the issue of energy security and climate change. We have taken a lot of measures to address this issue. So one measure is legislative measure. Next page. We, have adopted quite a lot of laws on energy and on the conservation of energy and renewable energy. So the first one, the energy conservation law, which was first adopted in 2002 and it was updated in 2007. And in 2005, we also adopted another very important law on energy, which is law on renewable energy, which provides stimulus to the development of Chinese renewable energy. In 2009, the People's Congress adopted a resolution on climate change, and I believe in the near future the Chinese People's Congress will maybe adopt a law on climate change, and I am expecting that. Next page, please. Apart from the legislative measures, we also adopted quite a lot of administrative measures. For example, the State Council formulated the mid- and long-term regulation to implement the energy conservation law, which is called the mid- and long-term regulation of energy conservation, which is very important and also conducive to the energy conservation of China. In order to address climate change, we also established a climate change leading group, which is chaired by the Premier himself, and also consisted about 20 ministries. And we also set up energy intensity goals in the 5-year plan, starting from the 11th 5-year plan, which started in 2006. And we have that was the 11th 5-year plan, and this year in March we adopted the 12th 5-year plan. And also we take a lot of measures, administrative measures, to shut down the inefficient coal power plants or steel and iron plants, aluminum plants, etc. And another important measure is to make the local authorities, the local leaders, be accountable to achieve this goal. So now the local leaders pay much attention to this, and also I think it's very effective. Next page, please. And also we have taken a lot of economic measures, just as to adjust the economic structure, to adjust the energy structure, and increase investment on energy efficiency and renewable energy. We also provide incentives to develop renewable energy. Next slide, please. And major achievements. One is the improvement of the economic structure. Of course, this is a very slight improvement, but now China is the second largest economy. Even this small slight improvement, actually it counts. And also we have improved our energy efficiency and increased our renewable energy. You know, in 2010, renewable energy has reached 300 million tons in the energy mix, which accounts for 9.6%. And from 2005 to 2010, China has shut down inefficient coal power plants with a capacity of 7.2 million kilowatts. And as the previous speakers pointed out, that the energy intensity per unit GDP has dropped 19% by 2010 on the 2005 level. Next page. Yeah, our future objectives. Yeah, there are two objectives. One is a short-term goal, which is set in the 12th five-year plan. The energy intensity costs 16%, and carbon intensity costs 17%. Non-fossil fuel reaches 11.4%, and also increase the forest coverage. And we have also midterm goal, which was pronounced in 2009, which has said by the previous speakers, and I do not want to repeat here. You can see on the screen. Next page, please. So the drivers of China's action, as Deborah has already pointed out, one is energy security. You know, we have a very low per capita energy reserves. We only account 11% of the world average petroleum reserve, and only 55% of coal reserve. So we are much lower the world's average fossil fuel reserves. And also we would like to diversify our energy resources. And another driver is the environmental and climate change concern. You know, China is a developing country, and we are affected by climate change. We experience a lot of droughts and floods every year, and desertification, land degradation, etc. So we have this kind of need to, consume less energy and to create more GDP. And to, we are in the process of development. The energy demand is increasing, so we have to to meet the needs of people in energy. And also we have to create more jobs for the people, in the renewable energy sector. Many people are employed in this sector. Next, please. Yeah, we have actually many difficulties. You know, China is a big country with 1.3 billion people. You know, our total emission is big, but actually the per capita emission is still low, and also we have a relatively short emission history. China is a developing country. Many people are still living under the UN poverty line. So actually there are about half of the US population who are still living under the $2 a day UN poverty line. So we have a lot of work to reduce and eradicate poverty, and we have to provide those people without access to energy resources. China is in the process of economic development and urbanization, so we are lack of actually advanced technologies, and we need energy to support our growth. Furthermore, China's energy endowment is coal, actually, which is more carbon intensive than other fossil fuels, of course, than renewables. Next. We would like to encourage international cooperation to address climate change and energy security. So we support the UN FCCC process, and also we support the common but differentiated responsibility principle, and also, we support the UN principle that all men are created equal in emission rights. And we support international cooperation to address climate change, and we hope that positive result can be achieved in Durban, South Africa this year. The U.S. has great influence on the world, and we appeal to the U.S. and other developed countries to take the lead in reducing emissions. Actually, I think this building is very powerful, and the staffers of the senators and the representatives are as powerful as well. And I hope that you can convey the message to the senators and the representatives that China will cooperate with you to address climate change and energy security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker to make some comments comes from a business perspective. There are any number of companies that are doing all sorts of work both in China, but also who are have companies and industries that are competing with China. And so to provide a little bit of perspective for a renewable company, we are going to hear from Kathy Weiss, who is the Vice President of Government Relations for First Solar, major solar company. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. Glad to be here. So I thought I'd just take maybe 2 slides, tell you a little bit about First Solar, talk about our perspective on policies and markets, and then finish up with a couple of comments on our experience in China. So First Solar was formed in 1999, and we launched production in 2002. We're among the largest PV manufacturers in the world. We make an advanced technology thin film, which basically describes the process that's used in the semiconductor material. So basically the manufacturing process is you start with a sheet of glass, it goes through the machine, 2.5 hours later it comes out as a solar module, and the semiconductor material is deposited on the glass in a vapor, and it's just a very thin film of semiconductor material. We've got annual manufacturing capacity of just a little bit over 2 gigawatts with announced expansions that'll get us to just under 3 gigawatts by 2012. Often folks hear, you hear folks saying that, China's cleaning our clock in terms of technology and solar investment, and we take issue a little bit with that. We're a U.S. company. The technology that I just described was actually came out of work that the DOE was doing with the University of Toledo, and right now we are the lowest cost producer in the world at 75 cents a watt as of the end of last year. Our technology has the smallest carbon footprint and fastest energy payback time, and we also have a pre-funded, so at the time of sale we put into a third-party account funds that will take back and recycle the modules at their end of life. We were ranked by Forbes magazine in 2009 and 2010 as the fastest growing technology company, and we've produced to date over 48 million solar modules. So this is just a quick picture of our global footprint. So we're here in the U.S. We've got manufacturing facility in Ohio, offices all throughout California, project development in Canada, offices in New York. Our EPC team, which basically because we're a project developer as well in the U.S., they engineer, procure, and construct utility scale solar projects. Most of the ones we have in the U.S. are in the Southwest, and they range from anywhere from 50 to 550 megawatt projects that we've got right now in various phases of development. We have manufacturing in Germany as well as Malaysia, and we've announced new manufacturing facilities in Vietnam and a second manufacturing facility in Arizona to start construction in the next month or so. So this sort of simple slide is really pretty powerful, and it gives you a pretty easy visual of the way we look at the solar markets and where we are today and where we need to go and what has to happen in order to get there. So the little red line just starting out there, that's kind of where we've been for the last 10 years. You've got an industry that's highly dependent on subsidy markets and those markets with very rich subsidies. But we're moving really now into what we would call transition markets, and those are markets that are now more willing to invest in solar energy because the prices come down, the subsidies that are needed aren't as great, and the competitiveness compared to other alternatives is improved. But also the infrastructure, the policy infrastructure, is starting to take shape so that you can actually deploy solar into these markets. Plus, if you look at the cost of whether it's wholesale or retail electricity, some places you're just going to be more competitive without the need for subsidies or with lower subsidies because of the cost in that market. So right now, I mean, this transition markets is really important, and that's where China plays a big role and the U.S. plays a big role, and certainly Europe continues to play a big role, because what we need to do is make sure that there is consistency in policy, that there's collaboration across countries, across markets, and with the industry, so that we can get to a point where the industry scales, costs can continue to come down, we're more competitive with traditional fossil fuel energy sources, and you're building in places where it makes sense to build, where there's high radiance, and we can continue to move on the curve where then we're actually a sustainable industry and markets are sustainable because you've got the policy infrastructure in place. And this just gives you a quick picture of the power of scaling. So the bars on the right show just our company and our growth in manufacturing, and the curve there shows coming down the cost line. So the good news is if you look at the 2012 bar, there's continued growing global demand for our product. Feed-in tariffs have been the largest policy driver. If you look, 77%, that's the policy that's been used in Europe, and China has a feed-in tariff that they've announced, as well as other countries. The U.S. does not have a feed-in tariff. There are small experiments that are around in different places, but some of the recent U.S. federal policies, including the Treasury Grant Program, DOE Loan Guarantee Program, Manufacturing Investment Tax Credit, and initiatives at the DOI to help speed the deployment, are really making a big impact in creating a quite attractive U.S. market. So this really just repeats a little bit of our market offerings that we bring to China. We do have a very large project. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the City of Ordos for 2 gigawatts. We've been working on that since 2009 when the MOU was signed. We've got a 30 megawatt pilot project that we've just had our pre-feasibility study approved, and we've also partnered with China's Guangdong Nuclear Solar Energy Development Company to do the build-out of that project. So this timeline gives you a quick look at 2009 and some of the different steps that China's taken between now and this year to put their solar incentives policy in place. And so they announced a feed-in tariff, and instead of coming right out and setting the tariff level, which is one of the most difficult and most important things to get right, what China decided to do was have concessionary bids. And so they announced a few projects and they let folks bid into the project, and that helped them figure out what the industry was willing to could build these projects for and get a sense for how to set these targets. And then there was a second round of concessionary bids in 2010, and we expect that there could be a third round this year. So this is a quick snapshot of the China solar market, and you can see the enormous growth that occurred between 2009 and where we expect the end of the year numbers at 2010 to come out. And so you've got about 36% of that is large-scale solar. The BIPV is sort of the built environment PV, and then other, which would be commercial and residential installations, about half of it. It's a lot of words on this, but basically it just goes into a little bit more detail about each of the sectors, so the large-scale PV sector and the distributed and rooftop sector. As others have mentioned, the 5-year plan has just been announced. There's incredibly important targets in there for solar, so between 5 and 10 gigawatts by 2015, which is just an enormous amount, and certainly would make China the world's largest solar market if we're talking about numbers like that. Folks have already talked about carbon reduction goals and renewable energy targets. I would just close by saying that the concessionary bidding process was, you can understand why they took that approach, but there really is a need to move beyond that now and actually institute a feed-in tariff so that companies get the predictability. You know what the tariff rate is. The concern is that if the prices are set too low based on someone's going to put in a bid for a project, they want to get that project, but that's the tariff could be so low that that's not really what it's going to take to have a sustainable market. Companies need to make a profit in order to reinvest in their businesses and scale, and make it an industry that you're not in and out as soon as you get that one project. You want companies to be around and grow. So we really encourage China to set that feed-in tariff and set it at a rate that makes sense and work with industry to set it. And also standards development. And there's been some good initial efforts to work with the world community on standard setting that makes sense. We support a life cycle assessment approach to setting benchmarks. Certainly the issue of IP protection, grid interconnection, and other tax policies are all areas that we're interested in collaborating as China moves from some trial policies into setting more long-term policies. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. All right, we have about 15 minutes remaining for questions or comments, and if you would just identify yourself when you ask your question. Okay, we'll start here. Okay. No, you just...
Thanks. Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. Thanks for doing this. This was all very interesting. I have a question on nuclear that I think for Mr. Sun first, if you wouldn't mind, and whoever else wants to ring in on it. But in the wake of Japan's disaster, we've read that China has put a hold on all new nuclear reactors until pending safety audits. Can you talk about how that will affect, if at all, China's non-fossil fuel goals and maybe the carbon intensity goals going forward? Will it slow it down?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I think these measures are temporary measures. Actually, it only just ensures the safety of nuclear power. And as time goes on, I think the Chinese government will lift these measures and begin to approve nuclear projects. But we should ensure the safety of nuclear energy. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
And I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about some of the key improvements in energy and greenhouse gas data collection, and also if there are any implications for listing energy and environment under national defense in the key industries, key strategic industries.
I don't think any of us understand the second question. Joanna was listing what the previous pillar industries would be and then what the new ones are. Is that what you were talking about?
Yes.
That's just one set and then another step. It wasn't that the one, they didn't link horizontally, only vertically.
Okay.
Mr. Swint, do you want to talk about data?
I am not an expert on, the actual scientific issues. We, have a relatively poor data collection base, but we would like to improve our data collection, and we hope to cooperate with the U.S. and other countries, to improve our data collection and to have international standard of data collection. So we are in the process of improving.
Okay. Did you want to say anything, Mark? Or
Yeah, I'll say
okay.
it. There it is. So we did an assessment of the first 3 years of the 11th five-year plan's effort to reduce energy intensity. And also we've been following national China energy data for a long time. We observed that in the late 90s, the National Bureau of Statistics lost a lot of staff, as well as other parts of the government that I talked about. And we were quite worried about the quality of the data at that time. I have to say, before the late 90s, China had the best statistical collection of data of any developing country. We once did a comparison with India, and there was no comparison. You could fill in most of the boxes from China. We noticed one of the things that's quite important at the aggregate level is that supply and demand have to be equal, minus exports plus imports plus whatever you have left over to storage. And we noticed that in 2000, 2001, 2002, that supply was significantly lower than demand. And it turns out that the data system wasn't very good in those years, and also the coal mines that were declared illegal produced no coal officially, but in fact did produce coal, and that wasn't counted in the statistics. But China came back and revised the numbers, so that at a national level you have a way of comparing and knowing if the data makes sense or not. When we looked at individual programs and tried to evaluate programs in the 11th five-year plan, it was very difficult. And for example, in the 1,000 Enterprise program, China did a very unusual thing. They had the enterprises report both to BS at the national level and through their chain. And that was to try to get better statistics on that program. But there continue to be problems. But there is an apparatus. There used to be. They built it up again. And whether it's resilient enough to keep track of CO2 emissions, probably not. But they have a basis.
Let me add a couple things. There's specific language in the 12th five-year plan on improving measurement and reporting systems. So it's one of the things that was in both the party document in October and then in the actual plan that was passed in March. One of the things that I think has been a huge advantage is because China set its carbon intensity goal prior to Copenhagen, so now almost a year and a half ago, there's been a lot more time for preparing for this plan goal than there usually is. Usually you don't know what the plan goal is until the plan is announced at the National People's Congress. For this one, there wasn't a lot of question about what it was going to be. And there's been a lot of back and forth between the center and the provinces over the last year, working out a lot of the data questions, discussing what the targets are going to be for individual provinces, although those haven't actually been set yet. But there's been a lot more research and a focus on getting those statistical information systems in better order than they had been. You can derive basic carbon dioxide numbers from the energy use because China committed to an energy-related greenhouse gas target, so not non-energy sources. But there's also going to be additional separate carbon dioxide data because they set a target for nitrous oxides, and the equipment you use to monitor NOx also collects carbon dioxide data. How that's going to be used yet, we don't know, but there should be a lot more information out there in this 12th five-year plan period than there has been in the past, and there's certainly been a lot more attention to building up the statistical systems in the last couple of years than there had been for a while prior.
I would just quickly add, I think most has been covered, but a lot of the statistical improvements are motivated by these domestic targets. But the international climate negotiations also have made some important progress in the area of national communications and increased, more frequent, more accurate greenhouse gas inventories that non-Annex I countries will be submitting. So China is one of these countries that has been supportive of that and will be updating their national inventories to the UN in line with the agreements in Cancun and Copenhagen.
Okay. We've got a lot of hands. We'll start here and work our way back first. Okay.
Yeah, hi, my name is Hans Martin, and I just wanted to bring up the 2010 U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission report identified three major challenges to U.S.-China energy cooperation, that being intellectual property rights issues, disenfranchising U.S. corporations, and the lack of transparency in China. And I'm just wondering if I could get your perspectives on how to move forward and address those challenges. Thank you very much.
That could be another whole seminar, but anyway. Who wants to take first step? Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sure that Kathy may have some comments on this, but I think that one thing that we're seeing in China is in terms of improvements to the intellectual property rights system is that as more innovation is taking place within China, as more companies are investing larger amounts of R&D, they have a much bigger stake in the intellectual property that they're developing and protecting it. So I think that this is actually one area that will be positive for U.S.-China cooperation, for foreign investment generally within China. And I think that, I think all those recommendations are certainly valid, but I do think that, you see a lot of improvements in these areas, and you see a lot of strong cooperation that's emerged in the last year or so, despite the challenges and the barriers, which I think is a positive sign.
I would just say briefly that if we see the market develop in China the way it has the potential to do, then that certainly would impact our decision on investing in a manufacturing facility there. And of course, in order to do that, we would have to make sure that we feel that our IP is protected. So that's certainly something that we give a lot of thought to and would be very important. You know, I think my reaction to the comment on transparency is that, you know, pretty much whatever market we're working in, and that includes the U.S., there are always transparency issues. So it's just one of those things where you know, forums like this, forums that you know, whether it's government to government or business to business, is really helpful. And the more we can do that, the better off it'll be, because there are challenges. If you're planning a business and you're planning investments, you not only want transparency, but you want consistency, and you want everybody to be on a level playing field. And I can think of, you know, several markets that we're in that's a challenge.
One thing to add is the number of energy partnerships that we're seeing in the last year or two has been just incredible. You have U.S. Major power companies partnering up with Chinese power companies for the first time ever. You have new alliances with the state grid company in China, which is going to be very important for the whole question of smart grid and grid expansion in both countries. So while there are these challenges, I think it's been my experience over the last 25 years that most of the way they've actually been addressed has been by companies coming up with things that protect themselves and meet their own best interests. And one assumes that they don't actually make agreements unless they are in their own interests. So I think these are things that they often talk about with the Chinese government as well. Sometimes the transparency issue is that things get published in Chinese that people don't even know are out there. But there are other issues as well. And it has been incredible how much more open about energy and climate policy Chinese government officials have been in the last couple of years, and getting out and meeting with people and talking about what the policy is. And that's certainly a tremendous plus.
Mr. Sun?
With regard to the protection of IP, I think I can tell you very clearly that the Chinese government has strong resolution to protect intellectual property. And of course, during the course of implementation of Chinese law on the protection of intellectual property, maybe there are some companies violate that. As soon as the government got the knowledge, we will, you know, suppress this kind of infringement. There is no question about that. With regard to transparency, we would also like to improve transparency. And, you know, some Chinese companies are also concerned with transparency here in the United States, because many Chinese companies want to invest in the U.S. and they do not know the procedures, the laws and regulations, and the custom and the traditions to invest in the United States. So they would also like to have more transparency of the U.S. to open to the Chinese enterprises. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. We'll work our way back. Okay, right here first, and then we'll get to the rest of you, and we'll take a few more minutes. Okay?
Mark Levine or anyone on the panel. We are a small business, but we have a commercialized technology that actually, believe it or not, does increase fuel efficiency and reduces emissions at the same time. However, we're not a very big company that has $250,000 to have a lab do an independent test. So is your organization, through the China Energy Group or any other organizations, a lab that you know out there that might be willing to take a look at our technology? And how do we go about that process?
Tell me again what your technology is.
It is a catalyst that increases fuel efficiency about 15 to 20%, and it reduces emissions 38 to 60%. And if used in China, we can probably get as high as 25% fuel efficiency. What it does is, in a nutshell, is it breaks down the hydrocarbon chains into small individual pieces of hydrocarbons. It expose it, it tracks with the heat, and you end up getting a complete combustion.
Yeah.
It atomizes the fuel.
That may be a question that should be dealt with perhaps after the briefing in terms of getting into that kind of specificity with regard to a given technology. Because we only have a few minutes left, I want to see whether there are any other questions on the topic for the panel. Okay, here first, and then we'll take one more. Okay.
Several of you mentioned programs like the Top 1000 and kind of named the programs, but I'm wondering if you could just very briefly kind of explain what the policy tools might be behind those efficiencies, if there was a difference between how the program approached state-owned enterprises or private business or different sectors, if there was any broad themes that you might identify in that. Thank you.
Let me take a crack at that. For the top 1,000, there are quotas that have been negotiated between the industries and the government, and the companies are under a lot of, shall we say, pressure to meet them. But they have the benefit of having subsidized loans, and the subsidy is, well, 250 RMB per ton of coal saved, but they have to demonstrate in the first year, but they have to demonstrate that they've actually saved that coal. So it's an interesting approach. Moving forward, China expects to use energy service companies as a way of investing in energy efficiency. In the building sector, what China's done is has greatly improved their inspection programs, and that has made a significant difference. Well, those are some examples of policies. You wanted to say something about that.
So, but if you want all of them, that's what we have the China Facts website for. So there's a fact sheet on the Top 1,000 program there. There are fact sheets on the Big 10 projects, other energy efficiency projects, and it lists all the policies. There's benchmarking, there are inspections, there's all kinds of things. We also list a lot of them in the paper we did on measurement, reporting, and verification a year and a half ago on the World Resources Institute website. But it's a useful way to get that is from China Facts. The other website I would recommend to you is Mr. Sun's organization's website, the Climate Change China website, ccchina.gov.cn, which has an incredible wealth of information in both Chinese and English.
And if you want details on all this, our study of policies and programs in the 11th five-year plan, you can get it off of china.lbl.gov. Lots of reports there.
Great. Two last questions, over here and then over there. Okay.
Companies. I didn't see that mentioned in any of the slides as being part of the initiatives, being part of the policies. So my question is, are they part of it? How are they going to be affected by kind of this push for renewable energy? Are they going to face more constraints at home? How is it going to affect their outward direct investment? If you could comment on that.
China's 9.5% of global oil demand, given the size of China. That's actually not a very high percentage. And it's very coal dependent. Coal is over 70%. So a great deal of focus is reducing coal and increasing other things. However, China's concerned about being, when we talk about energy security, import dependence is part of that concern. China now imports more oil than it produces at home, and it just surpassed. It just went above 50% this last year. In the short run, there isn't a whole lot of a solution for that. In the long run, that's why the Chinese are so interested in electric vehicles, because that would be a way to rely on domestic supply for its vehicle fleet. And of course, at the moment, they're pushing mass transit, both urban mass transit. They have like 30 cities planning subway systems or expanding existing subway systems, as well as high-speed rail as part of the way to address the liquid fuel issue. But, you know, in the long run, it's looking toward electrification.
And also they're buying resources by investing in oil companies in various places around the world.
Okay. Mr. Sun, did you want to comment? Or? Okay. Last question. Okay.
Two related questions. My name is Tim Wilkins with Polarity Energy. And one of the things that I wanted to get a sense of was on the feed-in tariffs. There's the concession bids on those tariffs. Are those tariffs broken out by category, or are they competitive across sectors? In other words, is there a specific tariff level set for solar, one for wind, and one for other categories? Would be the first question. The second question is there a qualification within those categories for industrial, combined heat and power cogeneration?
Yeah, feed-in tariffs are differentiated by resource type, and that's typically the way feed-in tariffs would be set up, whether in China or other places. And it's an interesting point, because in the U.S. we hear a lot about concern about picking winners and losers or over-incentivizing one sector over another, but yet the feed-in tariff does exactly that. It recognizes that different energy resources, solar, wind, tidal waves, are at different stages in their evolution and their scaling, and require different levels of support until they do mature. I actually don't know the answer to your heat and power question.
I can add a little bit. I mean, I think for the way that China has done feed-in tariffs for wind is they began with concessions for wind, and they use this as a way for price discovery, I guess I'd say. That, they do these competitive bidding projects and see what prices come in. They then base their wind feed-in tariffs on some of the information they got from the wind resource concessions. And there's 4 feed-in tariffs for wind that vary by wind resource regime throughout the country. There is no national standardized feed-in tariff yet for solar. They've done some project-based feed-in tariffs, and they're doing these large-scale concessions, as Kathy mentioned, which could be an indication that they'll use a similar system as they did for wind, using these concessions for price discovery and establish a national feed-in tariff. But I think there is some concern that the level that you would need to subsidize solar deployment is still quite a lot higher than for wind. It is still more expensive, so the government is assessing what the level should be. And then these would be just for renewables. There are separate pricing systems for combined heat and power, but I don't think it would. Yeah, there's feed-in tariff for biomass, but I'm not sure about the CHP tariff, how that's priced.
And are you thinking about CHP from coal or from natural gas?
I think I'm actually sort of indifferent on fuel sources. And in some states in the U.S., they actually do differentiate whether or not CHP qualifies as a renewable biofuel source. I'm not sure how that would work in China.
Well, the thing is, a lot of international folks who look at CHP are thinking about natural gas, and there just isn't much availability of it. So you have to be thinking in terms of coal.
Or in terms of thinking about biomass or other kinds of things in terms of providing a heat source too, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I guess. And biomass has a...
It has a feed-in tariff, you were saying. Okay, good. Okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panel. There was a lot of terrific information that was put forward, and I really, on behalf of EESI and WRI's China Facts program, we really appreciate your being here. And we will have the presentations posted on EESI's website, certainly by tomorrow. Today even, Laura says. So anyway, and that way, if you didn't have a chance to get the presentations or whatever, they will be available there on our website. So thank you very much again for terrific presentations, and we will all stay tuned because I think there is a lot more information that is going to be coming forth over the course of this next year that we'll want to follow. Thank you very much.